Thanks for coming to this CommonJS panel. So I'm assuming that there probably are still some people around who haven't heard of CommonJS. Hopefully we can help fix that today a bit more. Basically, the idea is that when you pick up a language like Python or Ruby or Java on the server side, you get a standard library that includes things like, well, I don't know, accessing standard I/O, files, command line arguments, and a lot of them even include like basic web servers and things like that as part of the standard library. And if you use CPython or PyPy or IronPython or Jython, doesn't matter which one of those you use, if you write to that standard library, it'll work regardless of which interpreter you're using. And also, whether you're using a Mac, Windows, or Linux, all of these standard functions are available. So for JavaScript, if you go and pick up one of our interpreters like SpiderMonkey or V8 or Rhino or JavaScript Core, or we've got several more, you'll find that you get date and regular expressions, and maybe that's about it. So the idea behind the CommonJS project is to try and fill in this gap so that we can define APIs that give you access to these kinds of things so that you can use JavaScript pretty reasonably for making server-side apps, command line apps, desktop apps, and where appropriate, you can also load some of these same modules in the browser. So obviously, if you've got a module that's using command line arguments, it doesn't make a lot of sense in the browser. Or depending on your module loading strategy in the browser, CommonJS may or may not work for your application. But generally speaking, that's the idea, is that we want to really fill in for the non-browser environments and also make it possible, at least, to use it in the browser as well. So that's the, the basic idea behind CommonJS. And so on this panel here, I don't know if I said who I am. I'm Kevin Dangor, but I'll let these guys introduce themselves. But what we're going to do for this panel today is, some panel discussions can get pretty unruly and out of control, and we don't want that. If anybody's looked at the CommonJS mailing list, we have some issues that are kind of divisive, and sometimes you'll get 100 messages in one discussion in one day, and we don't want that kind of thing here. Otherwise, we'd take up the whole time with one topic. So what we'll do is basically we'll take questions from the audience. I've got a list of questions if nobody has questions. And then we'll let those who want to answer that given question answer it. And we'll let them answer it for about a minute. After about a minute, the sword will drop. So we keep it under control on our ship here. So at this point, I will let the panelists introduce themselves so you have an idea of who all is here and how they might be able to answer questions about CommonJS. Take it away, Dean.
I'm Dean Landolt. I just kind of hang around the group and like to throw some punches every now and then. But I work with Chris Sipe on Pintura and PerStore, and I'm supposed to be giving a Trek B talk in like 10 minutes, so that's going to be fun. But so I primarily work on the JSCI spec.
I'm Chris Kowal, and I work mostly on the module system and writing specifications.
I'm James Duncan. I'm primarily responsible for the Smart platform, which is server-side JavaScript thing. So CommonJS is kind of important to me.
I'm Ryan Dahl, and I write Node.js.
All right. So I will actually start it off handing it to the audience, should you have any questions. Oh, and I'll also mention that JSGI, since not everybody knows our fun little acronyms, is the web server interface. So if you've ever used Rack in Ruby or WSGI in Python, it's the same kind of thing. So you can attach your web applications to your web servers in a standard way. So if anybody in the audience has anything that they're curious about with respect to CommonJS, sure.
Sort of modules question. Obviously, modules in server right now load really fast because everything's local. If you extend that to the client, stuff doesn't load really fast. It tends to be some kind of asynchronous loading. What's the strategy that you can use to fix modules?
I suppose I should take that one. There are a whole bunch of ways to deal with that problem, and it's not a simple problem even without CommonJS. So ultimately, you're going to need to use a bundling strategy of some kind, some combination bundler, and you're going to need to asynchronously load the transitive dependencies of all of the modules that you're going to use at some point. So for the simple case, it's a matter of of taking your CommonJS modules and compiling them to a form that can be loaded in the browser with a single script injection or any of the other varieties of techniques. It is a really big problem, of course, to do the trivial solution, which is to use a synchronous XHR whenever you reach a require function, which guarantees that the modules would be lazily loaded, but it also has huge problems for the browser, which was admittedly the first way I wrote the prototype for the module system. But no, the right solution is to use a bundler. There's one called Tiki. There's one called Modular by Toby Langle of Prototype fame, and we expect more to come. We're working on a specification for how to construct a script injection format for modules so that different module providers can create packages that anybody can use with their client side. And there's a proposal called Modules Async A, which provides a browser-side hook for registering modules in the script injection. Transports A through D are proposals for the script injection side, and Async A is the proposal for the hook that would asynchronously load one of these packages and begin executing the program. That's the general idea. Thanks.
So basically, CommonJS at this point, the most widely accepted spec that we've got is the module spec. There are lots of module loaders at this point. But there are a lot of other specs in the works, and so I wanted to see what our panelists think are sort of the big things that need to be dealt with right now. Like, what are the biggest, the most important specs to work on?
So I've had quite a bit of trouble trying to get file system access to work across Node, and Narwhal is actually Chris's project and Tom Robinson's over here's project, and it is a CommonJS standard library. Trying to get that to work and Node to work with certain applications, like to try to get file system access, is just painful. So I'm hoping we can get that going. I think we were talking about last night, promises is a big one. I'd really like to see us at least standardize on some baseline simple thing so that we could move forward with some of our stuff that might, some other specs that might depend on promises. They're obviously very controversial, so not everything has to have promises. I mean, obviously you could build all of that on top of callbacks, but
Actually,
promises.
You might want to explain what a promise is, because there are probably a lot of people in this audience
Oh yeah, I
who
keep
don't know that term.
I always assume that,
Yeah, we
everybody's.
throw it around, and it's, yeah.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things we should work on in the list in general. I think there's a lot of knowledge that we have just because we've been doing this for over a year. Like, there's a lot of lingo now that is probably tough to pick up, and there's a lot of mailing list discussion. So we should probably have some sort of summary page. That should be the first thing we work on, perhaps. Okay, so a promise is effectively. I should probably let you explain it, Chris, because.
A promise is a representation of the return value of a function that cannot be returned without a long latency operation like file system or network access. And it's an event emitter, effectively, and it's also a representation of the state. It has three states: the before resolution, at the time of resolution, and after, represented by whether it's been resolved or fulfilled, depending on which vocabulary you use. It's similar to a future or a deferred, if you're talking about Dojo or Twisted in Python. There's a particular brand of promises, I should say, that I'm promoting that isn't ratified at all, by Tyler Close and Mark Miller, Tyler Close from HP and Mark Miller from Google, that uses an external API and defines promises as opaque objects that can be implemented in a variety of ways, that guarantees the robust composition of programs that are all running in the same asynchronous event loop, so that they don't trample each other and mess with each other's invariants inadvertently. There's a particular brand of promises, I should say, that I'm promoting that isn't ratified at all, by Tyler Close and Mark Miller from Google, that uses an external API and defines promises as opaque objects that can be implemented in a variety of ways, that guarantees the robust composition of programs that are all running in the same asynchronous event loop, so that they don't trample each other and mess with each other's invariants inadvertently. Yeah, so it's a promise, in summary, is a representation of the return value of a function that has not yet resolved and will eventually resolve.
So what I think is important about CommonJS, or for CommonJS, yeah, I think figuring out the file system stuff would be good. I mean, I'm obviously a proponent of having some asynchronous ways of doing these things. So yeah, I think that would be a good thing, and I think that figuring out the binary APIs would be good, because that's something that's becoming fairly problematic right now for me.
So, yeah, the original question I think was what sort of should CommonJS look at next? I think there's a bunch of stuff in the pipeline which is really interesting, but I think controversially I'm going to say nothing. And I think I'm using that term carefully. The best standard really is sort of a de facto standard that everyone just does, because there's no bureaucracy in the way. And I think in some cases with JavaScript where perhaps we've got this opportunity to see what happens. And in some areas it's very obvious we need the standards. Modules is a perfect example of that. But I'm cautious. We don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves and start standardizing things that don't need to be standardized, because we've got the opportunity, maybe for the first time in a long time, to innovate. So let's not stamp on that before we get the chance to.
Speaking of the pipeline, and as Ryan pointed out, I think that the one CommonJS module proposal that is blocking everything else is definitely having a binary API for a way of dealing with byte quantized binary data, and secondarily, after that unlocks the ability for us to go forward with I/O and with file system. Both synchronous and asynchronous, everything's waiting for binary. We also need to make some resolutions about how to deal with the synchronous versus asynchronous file system I/O. I think that we definitely need to go forward with an async file I/O specification. I also think that it would be good to have a synchronous one, but that remains contentious. And we do need to also work on carving out our namespaces so that we're future compatible with, so that we leave room for innovation in the implementations, and also leave room for eventually, when we discover that our implementations are all suitably similar, moving those things into a common namespace so that we can start actually writing interoperable code.
So just to reply to what James said, I also think that I think CommonJS presents itself too much as a standards body when it's not really. I mean, anybody can call themselves a standards body. I mean, it's a mailing list of people who are interested in creating APIs for JavaScript that work outside the browser. And in that respect, it's great because people discuss these to infinite detail, and there's a lot of thought that goes into that. But talking about being CommonJS compliant is kind of a farce in some way. I mean, there is no JavaScript outside the browser. If there was any, it would probably be Node. So I mean, there's no real point in making things standard. There's a point in talking about them and saying how they should be done, but until we have multiple systems, server-side JavaScript systems, if you want to call them that, then that people are actually using instead of just making cute demos with, which, I mean, honestly, I don't think is really being done to any extent. So I think it's important to not take this so seriously.
I just want to. I mean, I understand there aren't a whole lot of applications right now that have that. The intent of them is to run across engines, but I think the ultimate goal is so that there can be an ecosystem of applications that aren't just node specific, that aren't just narwhal specific, or I mean, as Kevin mentioned, there's a number of engines and there's a lot of innovation going on. It's really cool that it's happening down at such a low level, and if we can bridge some of those gaps, then we don't have to do it all manually every time. And it's really painful to have to hack around all these different APIs. That said, I mean, I understand that it's not a good idea to just standardize on something but if at certain levels, like binary file system, I mean, there's no way to write a common application without a standard, I think.
And I agree. I mean, at some point, we definitely will want to have a standard. It's just, things take time. We can't just force this to happen in 3 months or something. And it's just going to take a year or 2 years. And then, this stuff will be developed. And then at that point, we can sit down and say, okay, what happened right and what happened wrong? And then we can try to make this work. But it's just going to be painful. I mean, that's just the case. But I mean, I think we all recognize that too.
Sure, we'll take it.
My question is, given the CommonJS system of having these multiple specifications being out there and being concurrently developed and being discussed, you guys are talking about evolutionary development. How do you see that as that sounds, what you're saying here sounds like it mirrors the reality of the case, because there are these parallel implementations for various specs. The panelists reflect on that. You feel like your writing system is addressing that there will be long-term evolution and maybe perhaps convergence when it makes sense?
You want to repeat that question?
So the question basically is, does the current CommonJS strategy for documenting the specs and for coming up with the specs match the reality of the what's going on the ground? And I think the answer to that is yes. That as the question suggests, there is multiple documentation processes around the same spec. I mean, I think at the same time as we haven't yet fully ratified modules 1.1, there's modules 1.1.1, which is, it shows that what's actually happening is innovation on the ground, where this is being implemented in a system, and then really what the CommonJS list seems to be doing from my eyes, and I'm not a huge participant in the list, to be quite honest, but I am an observer. What seems to be happening is the list is taking the implementation and basically recording what has happened on the ground, so that perhaps other people can come along and implement it. So from that perspective, I think it's doing well, and it is matching the reality. And will we get converging specs? You know what? Like, we have the W3C, and the browsers can't have a converging spec in a situation where you have a very heavily centralized standards body. So I'm not necessarily sure you'll see it with JavaScript, but it's ultimately up to the implementers.
I see the reality of the situation at the moment as being somewhat incongruous with our ideals. Particularly, I think that we started this with the notion that there was eventually going to be a file system module that everybody could use. I don't think that that's the reality of the situation at the moment, and I think that some of our early decisions with naming modules on each of our individual platforms, we were presumptuous about what would go forward. I think that this is going to be a platform. CommonJS is going to be a platform with the goal of perhaps providing some of the things coming from Ruby and Python, where you have a definitive standard library, but it's going to evolve in a very different way because, like the browser, it's about multiple implementations. It's not about having a de facto implementation and then converging all around that one de facto implementation. It's very much going to be a tug of war among all of the implementations. And in order to do that gracefully, I think that the APIs are going to look very different. I think that we need to move in the direction where we name modules with the idea that they are versioned and that they are going to eventually perhaps be deprecated. They're eventually going to be migrated to more central proposals as they become more, because as they converge with other implementations. For example, we have, we had a file module on Narwhal. It's down. All right, moving right along.
We've been on this topic for a while, so I just wanted to keep it going. Yep.
Yeah, I was just curious. So clearly there's still some working out to do in maybe 3 months and maybe 2 years or whatever. Do you think that the best thing to do for people to use this in real world is to stake their claim on one implementation like Narwhal or like Node.js and just do that for a while? Or would it be better served for us to be building some sort of gap framework similar to what browsers did, so that there's something that people could do now that would be able to abstract away those differences as they evolve?
Pick a technology. That's my simple answer. In truth, we talk about interoperability between implementations, and there's some sort of like mythical goal of being able to swap out the back end of a system. In reality, you know what? People don't do that. Like in reality, what happens is what we're actually looking for is that when there's a library available for one thing, we can use it elsewhere. Very rarely as an implementer of something or an organization deploying software, do you say, you know what? That back end choice of technology, not so good, going to swap it out and sort of swap something else in and not worry about it. It just doesn't happen so much like that in reality is what I believe. I think I might hear something different.
I agree with that, but I think at a packager level, it does happen. So with Persevere 2.0, I mean, it's a couple of CommonJS packages, and the idea is to not pick a technology. I mean, maybe that's, a crazy idea. Yeah, well, not pick, like when you say pick a technology, not pick Node or Narwhal, just not spec the underlying engine or the underlying platform so that you guys can pick a technology. And so that's where the interoperability comes in. It just hasn't come in yet. I mean, it does run on both things. There's just a hack, there's a series of hacks that have to happen to make that work. It'd be nice to get rid of them, but I mean, it really bridges the two. So it does it relatively eloquently. It doesn't take a whole lot of extra code. It just takes some glue modules, essentially. And it would be really cool to actually have a package that worked that way. I think Chris Zipe's CommonJS utils is kind of intended to do that very thing.
Yeah, and it looks like we have reached the end of the time for the panel. We will all, of course, be around for the rest of the day. So if you have CommonJS questions, definitely feel free to grab one of us. If you want to argue with us about more of these things, we'd love to argue. So thanks for coming. By all means, we'll see you later.